In this lecture, we return to North Africa, where the Donatists pull off a virtual repeat of the Novatian Schism. But this time, the new schism meets its match in the most influential and important teacher of the ancient church, Augustine of Hippo. But first, a few comments on some terms that I have been using and will continue to use. When we talk about the Catholic Church in this period, we mean the whole mainstream church, excluding schisms and sectarian movements. That term Catholic comes from the Greek katholikos, and it means universal. So try not to think of the medieval or the modern Roman Catholic Church that is now distinct from the Eastern Orthodox or from Protestants. In the 4th and 5th centuries, there is still one worldwide Christian movement. Second, I sometimes refer to the Bishop of Rome in these early centuries as Pope, which is common practice, but keep in mind that the papacy, as it later develops, does not yet exist, particularly as a monarchical structure. It's true that all the churches do recognize that Rome has a special place among the churches. In fact, there was an Eastern Orthodox theologian by the name of Alexander Schmemann, not Roman Catholic, who writes of, quote, the testimonies of the fathers and the councils unanimously acknowledging Rome as the senior church and the center of ecumenical agreement. Now that term pope, it comes from the Greek papas, which means papa, father. The term pope was used for all bishops in the early centuries of the church, but in the West around the 10th century, it became the sole title of the Bishop of Rome, whose role became analogous to that of the emperor in the empire. The Pope became the head of the church. But in our centuries, the Bishop of Rome is the senior bishop among equals. Now, in this course, of course, context is very important, and the context of the Donatist schism is the great persecution of the Emperor Diocletian, a persecution against Christians and other non-Roman religions that lasted from 303 to 313. And again, a similar issue arises for the church. What do you do with those, particularly clergy, who give in to the persecution, who compromise? And in this case, one of the things that was demanded of Christian clergy was that they turn over their scriptures and also turn over their members. And coming from that Latin word to turn over, we get the term traditor, somebody who turns over. And traditors were now the lapsed, those people that were considered to be fallen. And you remember at this time, the church really venerates and admires those who don't fall, who die for their faith. In fact, our word traitor comes from the word traditor. In North Africa, the church is still divided over those issues that had given Cyprian so much trouble 50 years earlier. There are rigorists who are very tough on sinners, especially those who cave in to persecution. There are rigorists like Tertullian and Novatian. Even Cyprian himself was a rigorist, but he was willing to compromise. That was a very important difference. And in the year 311, a man by the name of Cecilian of Carthage is elected bishop. This is a contested election because Cecilian is not a rigorist. He's more lax, he's more forgiving, actually more gracious toward those who fall under the threat of persecution. And another issue that arises is that he opposes excessive veneration of the martyrs. He says it's getting out of control. It probably also threatens the authority of the bishop, that the people are basically worshiping these martyrs. There's the spiritual hero worship that is going on. And if this isn't enough to make him a bad guy in the eyes of the hardliners, a man was involved in Cecilian's consecration as bishop, one of the people that laid hands on him, a man by the name of Felix, and it was alleged that Felix was a traditor. Now, this is enough to make Cecilian's consecration invalid in the eyes of the hardliners, or at least to give them an excuse to question the legitimacy of his office of bishop. Another issue that was very important was a very powerful, influential, and wealthy woman in the North African church by the name of Lucilla. Cecilian was not a man to bow to the rich and powerful. Well, Lucilla was a leading figure in the rigorous party, and she had opposed Cecilian, and she had promoted a man from her own household, Mairinus, to be bishop. But Cecilian won out, and Cecilian was elected. But when Cecilian dared to rebuke her for kissing a relic, she had a bone of a martyr, and Lucilla would kiss this relic before she took the Eucharist. Cecilian said, "We don't do that. We should not do that." And she said, "You know what? That's too much. You cross a line now." She had Mairinus consecrated as a rival bishop, and the schism began. Now, Mairinus, he was just a puppet. He didn't last long. He was replaced as rival bishop by a man by the name of Donatus in 313, and that's where the Donatists get their name. Now, here is the perspective of the Donatist church. Their first assertion was that the church must be pure. They are as rigorous as Tertullian and Novatian. Secondly, in order for the church to be pure, the ministry must be pure. Sacraments that are performed by fallen or unholy clergy are invalid. Doesn't count. And they claimed that they were the only true church. And by the way, any church that claims it's the only true church most certainly isn't. The only churches that make that kind of claim are sectarian and heretical churches. They claim that the Catholic sacraments, therefore, are invalid. The Catholic Church is a false church. The mainstream church is false. Therefore, their sacraments don't count. And as a result, anybody who had been baptized in the mainstream church, who finds themselves in a Donatist congregation, has to be rebaptized. By the way, that is an ancient baptistry from the 5th or 6th century from the area of Carthage. But the Donatists will meet their match in the person of Augustine of Hippo. He was a man of incredible intelligence. He was very skilled in classical learning and rhetoric. Now, he had lived a wild life in his youth, and he had 2 mistresses, and he had a son. He was a Manichaean for a while. He was kind of a spiritual seeker of a sort, and he took in the teaching of the great Bishop Ambrose of Milan until, as he relates in his Confessions, which, by the way, I do recommend reading, he felt moved to take and read, that is, tolla lege in Latin, the Christian scriptures. His mother, Monica, was a Christian who had been praying for Augustine's conversion throughout his whole adult life. And not only did Augustine come to the faith, he became the most important thinker in the history of Western Christianity. Made a bishop in the African city of Hippo sometime after the year 395, Augustine takes on the Donatists after they had divided the African church for more than 80 years. So Augustine doesn't take the Donatists on right at the beginning of the Donatist movement. They've been going on for a couple of generations already. And Augustine has 3 basic arguments that he deploys against the Donatist schismatics. First, he says the Donatist view of purity is just way too narrow, and it's not biblical, and it's not realistic, it's not practical. Nobody can live up to that kind of standard of holiness. Secondly, he says the Donatist sect is kind of insignificant. They're not the universal church, and their claim to be the universal church is just silly. They're just an insignificant splinter sect in Africa, says Augustine. And he writes, with his rhetorical skill and not a little mockery, he writes, "The clouds of heaven thunder out throughout the world that God's house is being built, and the frogs cry out from the marsh, 'We are the only Christians.'" A little mockery of the Donatists there. And then thirdly, he says that the schismatic Donatists do not represent the legacy of the revered, honored Cyprian, even though they appeal to him and his authority. Cyprian, remember, he did not split the church, and he was willing to compromise. And for the Donatists, compromise is exactly what's wrong with the church. And because of the emphasis on the sacraments being valid or invalid, we're going to look at Augustine's view of the sacraments. Against the Donatists, Augustine argues that there is no reason to ever rebaptize a person. The Apostle Paul says, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. Further, he says it's a hopeless argument, he says, because how holy does the pastor have to be in order for your baptism to be legit, to be effective? Where do you draw the line? And the result of that is that believers can be filled with anxiety and uncertainty who don't know for sure whether their baptism is valid. And in contrast to the Donatist view, where everything depends on the holiness of the person who performs the sacrament, Augustine talks about sacrament as an indelible mark that is made by God in his word and spirit. Ordination, baptism, they both impart an indelible mark on the person who's being baptized or ordained. And the idea comes from the Roman army. And around Augustine's time, around the year 400, the Roman soldiers were marked on their hand with an indelible permanent mark. And that mark might have been a tattoo or a brand that kept them from running away from the army. And this becomes standard Christian doctrine, the idea that the sacraments don't depend on the person who administers the sacrament. And then Augustine asks, are the sacraments really all about us anyway? Or are sacraments signs of the God who acts and the God who saves and the God who makes promises in the sacraments? And thus Augustine records this exchange between himself and a Donatist by the name of Petilian. Petilian says about the sacraments, what we look to is the conscience of the giver to cleanse that of the recipient. And Augustine answers, we need have no anxiety about the conscience of Christ. But if you assert any man to be the giver, whoever he may be, there will be no certainty about the cleansing of the recipient, because there is no certainty about the conscience of the giver. In other words, it is God who acts in the sacraments. God makes a promise. God makes a claim on a person who receives the sacrament. And if there's any conscience cleaning going on, it's Christ who's doing that cleansing through his Spirit to the glory of the Father. The sacraments are not all about you, they're all about God. And believe me, that will preach. Now, Augustine points out that the authentic church, the Catholic Church, the universal church, considers Donatist baptism to be valid. The mainstream church does not rebaptize persons who have been baptized by the Donatists, by schismatic priests and bishops. Yet that baptism, he says, is ineffective because of the schism that has been created by the Donatist leaders, separating believers from each other and leading them astray. And Augustine says that sacraments are valid this is an important theological term, ex opere operato, by the working of the work. That is, when you receive the sacrament, it doesn't depend on the person who's administering it. It depends on the God who makes promises in that sacramental act. It's very important. He also describes sacraments, we saw this in your reading, as visible signs of an invisible reality. And he describes the sacraments as signs to which a promise has been inseparably attached. Now on to Augustine's view of sin and love. It's closely related to Augustine's doctrine of humanity. And here Augustine's two kinds of love come into play, love of God and love of self. And Augustine makes an important distinction between using something and enjoying something. But the terminology can be a little bit misleading, a little bit different than how we use the English words. So we have to carefully look at this, carefully understand this. The Latin word uti means to use, like to utilize something. Utilitarian comes from that word. Frui means to enjoy. Fruit and fruition come from that word. And Augustine uses the term uti to use to mean loving something as a means to an end, enjoying something on a lower level than as your ultimate goal. So if you say, I enjoy a nice glass of wine, or I live to drink wine, that's the difference. Okay? And it makes a huge difference. Frui is to love something as the end in itself. What is your highest goal? What is the thing that drives you in life? What do you love most of all? And Augustine says that human beings were created with properly ordered love. In paradise, our first parents, their love was properly ordered. And what that means is that you love God as your highest end, your ultimate goal. God is your highest love in life. And Augustine is famous for saying in his Confessions, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, that is, in God. And then the things of the world, those things are to be used as a means to an end, not as an end in themselves. The 17th century Westminster Shorter Catechism draws directly on these Augustinian ideas when it asks, what is the chief end of man? What is the main purpose of humanity in this world? Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. And if you notice the Latin, it uses that word frui. They're directly drawing on Augustine's thought. Now, this does not at all mean that Christians don't enjoy things in the world, that they don't appreciate God's creation and the good things in God's creation. In fact, they could even enjoy them more. Richard Baxter, who's called a Puritan, I would rather say that he is a English Reformed theologian. That term Puritan is somewhat problematic. He writes, oh, therefore the Christians were skilled in this art, that is, of putting God first in their lives. Certainly by such a skillful, industrious improvement, we might have a fuller taste of Christ and heaven in every bit of bread that we eat and every draught of beer that we drink than most men have in the use of the sacrament. In other words, when you put God first in your life, you enjoy the things of this world more. You appreciate them more. You recognize the giver of those gifts. When you live for food, that doesn't turn out well. When you live for drink, that doesn't turn out well. But when you receive them as gifts from God, as means to an end of living your life and glorifying God in your life, then you appreciate them even more. Now, Augustine views the fall as a disordering of human loves. And sin is really disordered love. because now we love ourselves most of all and pursue things as an end in themselves instead of pursuing God and using things. In addition, the effects of our first parent sin are irreversible. Augustine thinks of sin almost like an addiction, and that's actually not unbiblical. It's not an unbiblical way to think about it. If you're familiar with 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step is we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol or over drugs or whatever the group is about. And you could say the same thing about sin. Human beings are powerless over sin, as the Apostle Paul says in Romans 7. In Augustine's case, he would have talked about sexual lust most of all, because that was Augustine's biggest issue in his younger life. In fact, he has a hard time separating sexuality from sin. That's something that's problematic, I think, about Augustine and problematic about the early church, so that they tend to view celibacy as somehow a holier and purer calling than marriage. This becomes an issue. In some, Augustine says there are two kinds of love of God, amor Dei, and love of self, amor sui. And when you put love of self first, that's disordered love. Augustine says in his famous treatise, The City of God, accordingly, two cities have been formed by two loves, the earthly by the love of self, even to the contempt of God, the heavenly by the love of God, even to the contempt of self. And that brings us to Augustine's view of the church, his ecclesiology, which serves as a counter to the Donatist view. Augustine's lengthy work, The City of God, uses the imagery of two cities, the city of the world and the city of God. Now, the city of the world is not creation. Don't think of it as the created world. It's not the realm of government. It is humanity in its state of sinful rebellion. It is a society that puts the love of self before the love of God. And the city of God, on the other hand, is the society, a people who long for the new creation, the new Jerusalem, and whose longing for that new world shapes how they live in this world. James K.A. Smith writes, the city of God is that society of people, that civitas, who are called to embody a foretaste of the social and cultural life that God desires for this world. Civitas, by the way, is the Latin word for city. So what James K.A. Smith is describing there is the church as a kind of appetizer for the new creation. We are intended to whet people's appetites for a newer, better, redeemed world. But, Augustine emphasizes, the church is a pilgrim church. It is on the way to perfection, and perfection will not be attained in this life or in world history until Christ returns. And the distinction between the two cities is not always that clear or clear cut. Not everyone, for example, in the church is elect, and not everybody out there in the unbelieving world is destined to remain an unbeliever. The church is a mixed body, Augustine says, not a pure church, not a rigorous church like the Donatists say. The church is a mixed body, a corpus permixtum in Latin. It contains both the wheat and the tares, and, contrary to the Donatists, it is not our job to sort everybody out. It's not our job to separate the wheat from the tares. So you can't always judge who's in the city of the world and who's in the city of God. And besides, you shouldn't make that judgment anyway. What Augustine does, in essence, is to restore grace to the doctrine of the church. And this concept of pilgrimage, a people who are on the way, the already and the not yet, people who have not yet arrived at their destination. For Augustine, this is a better image than that heroism, that spiritual hero worship that prevails among the rigorists, the former Novatians, and then in Augustine's time, the Donatists. Christianity is not only for the spiritual superheroes. Christianity is for, and especially for, those who fall, those who are weak, those who stumble, those who cave in under pressure, those who need grace and need forgiveness and need restoration. The heroic spirituality of the Donatists is all about being good, not about being forgiven. And Augustine comes and restores the gospel to the doctrine of the church.